With that, let me move to the main presentation for this evening. I will begin with a snapshot of the founding of our university and its museum to better appreciate the context of the 1959 donation. The University of Malaya, as NUS was formerly known, was established in 1948 upon the recommendation of the British Colonial Office, in particular, the Carr-Saunders Report. The same report recommended an undergraduate art history course, which was implemented in 1952 to be quickly followed up with a University Art Museum in 1955. It was emphasized that the museum would support the art history curriculum, both in its writing and teaching. Hence, the roles of the curator of the university museum and the lecturer of the art history course were conceived as a joint appointment. Michael Sullivan became the first curator and lecturer from 1955 to 1960. He desired a collection that would include artifacts from the South Asian subcontinent, along with Chinese and Southeast Asian objects. Sullivan's wish would be fulfilled within 4 years of setting up the museum. In 1959, the government of India donated 55 artifacts and 100 photographs to the University Museum. This wide-ranging donation included pre- and proto-historic ceramics, classical and medieval Hindu-Buddhist sculptures, bronze icons and ritual objects, Rajput and Mughal manuscript paintings, hand-embroidered textiles from Kashmir, Sindh, and Bengal, and examples of modern art by the iconic M.F. Husain and H.A. Gade. Now, as far as archival sources are concerned, we have only 2 sets of records: a commemorative catalogue and a handful of press articles. The donation arrived in April 1959 at the university's Bukit Timah campus. An exhibition was held to commemorate this donation, and a catalogue was published on the occasion. This catalogue, which we see on the slide, has since served as the sole primary record of this gift. In the introduction to the catalogue, Sullivan thanked the government of India and 2 individuals in particular, R.K. Tandon, the former Commissioner for India to Singapore and the Federation, and Malcolm MacDonald, Chancellor of the University of Malaya. Since no particular institute, agency, nor ministry is named in the catalogue, it is difficult to trace the donated artifacts to any specific collection or city in India. No dedicated files have turned up at the repositories in Singapore or New Delhi. The only direct records, I repeat, are the exhibition catalogue and the press articles which reported this donation. However, indirect references to this donation emerge in the context of a Department of Indian Studies, which was proposed at the University of Malaya in the 1950s. Between 1952 to 56, protracted conversations transpired among representatives of the University of Malaya, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, the Indian Ministry of Education, and members of the Indian diaspora. Language-based constraints and language-based factions led to differences over what could become a Tamil, a Hindi, or a Sanskrit-focused department versus a broader Department of Indian Studies. After much deliberation, the chief consulting scholar, Professor Neelakanta Shastri, advocated a broad approach to Indian studies. Now, what remains relevant for our purposes this evening is that the idea of purchasing Indian artworks was first expressed in this context of an Indian studies curriculum in 1955. While further archival research proves that such a purchase was eventually never made, the 1959 donation could have been a response to this initial proposition. Moreover, names such as MacDonald, Sullivan, Tandon, and the Government of India form an overlapping cast of characters associated with both the Department of Indian Studies and the 1959 donation. The interlinked nature of these initiatives ascertains that the donation was conceived within a broad pedagogical mandate which sought to augment Indian studies with archaeology, art history, and museums. Now, despite these direct or indirect references, gaps remain in our understanding of the purpose and the scope of this gift. How do we read this donation beyond its obvious nature as a diplomatic gift? I suppose the answers lie in the geographical and temporal location of this donation. An India-Malaya exchange, which occurs in 1959, makes this gift worthy of being opened up to a wider political and cultural context. And by this, I mean the conjoined tracks of decolonization and third world solidarities, nation building and modernization, and Cold War diplomacies and non-aligned movements. Let me explain why these triple tracks should have a bearing on the 1959 museum exchange. As most of us know, the conclusion of the World War in 1945 and the beginning of the Cold War marked the end of colonial empires. Decolonizing and newly independent nation states pledged to remain united and not align with former colonial powers nor with the new Cold War blocs. These shared ideological and political commitments created a highly interconnected global condition. New partnerships were forged across borders as part of a third world coalition. Many of us will agree that the Bandung Conference of 1955 stands out as a seminal platform to stimulate political, economic, and cultural coalitions within the Afro-Asian world. Can we then say that the India-Malaya Museum exchange was inspired by the Bandung movement and its ethic of solidarity, so that India and Malaya imagined themselves in a cultural partnership which was defined by the sharing of resources as opposed to the colonial mentality of exclusive ownership? From here, the presentation raises a set of questions to unravel possible motivations which may have guided the 1959 donation. Was this gift a straightforward expression of solidarity between India and Malaya, such as the one inspired by Bandung, which I just mentioned? Or was the plot more complicated to deserve greater critical attention? As an example, did this donation assert India's hegemony, i.e., its civilizational and cultural superiority? More specifically, did this gift-giving act assume post-colonial India's promotion in a new regional order via cultural diplomacy? Or was this donation received in an altogether different spirit of envisioning a multicultural Malayan nation? By raising these different and sometimes contradictory questions, this presentation seeks to understand the donation as a coalescence of diverse motivations. To ensure that we do not read this donation from an exclusively Indian or a Malayan standpoint, it is crucial to adopt a transcultural approach. As explained by art historian Monica Juneja, such an approach is underpinned by the belief that in a highly globalized or a highly interconnected order, objects and practices cannot be assessed from a fixed cultural or political standpoint. Instead, we must open up objects, ideas, and even donations such as this one to the logic of movement, to consider multiple locations and transboundary imaginations. These imaginations could well carry individual, institutional, or even state-backed perspectives. So following in this transcultural approach, from here the presentation will consider and probe 4 different viewpoints. The first is the Indian viewpoint or that of the donor. The second is a Malayan viewpoint or that of the recipient, particularly the curators who received this donation. The third viewpoint will consider the nationalist mood within which this donation arrived in Malaya. And lastly, the donated objects too must have their own perspectives, and hence we will undertake an object-based reading. So let us consider the first viewpoint, i.e., an Indian state-backed perspective. Now, the 1959 exhibition catalogue suggests India's cultural expansion into Southeast Asia as both a backdrop and a rationale for the donation. This rationale, as many of us know again, aligns with the Indianization of Southeast Asia, a theory which was actively advanced during the Indian independence movement. Scholars asserted the notion of a pre-colonial India that had the power to establish colonies of its own within Southeast Asia. It was believed that this Indian colonizing migration brought its own cultural, political, and religious agendas to Southeast Asia, including, for instance, the grand Hindu-Buddhist structures of Angkor and Borobudur. In summary, the Indianization of Southeast Asia presented India as a bringer of civilization, or even as the mother of all influences in Southeast Asia. This theory of the Indianization of Southeast Asia may be understood through what Dipesh Chakrabarty refers to as the pedagogical mode of decolonization, wherein, so this theory may be understood through what historian Dipesh Chakrabarty refers to as a pedagogical mode of decolonization, wherein the performance of politics reenacts civilizational or cultural hierarchies between nations. In this case, perhaps, India emphasized her cultural hegemony or her position at the apex of a cultural hierarchy through the 1959 catalogue. But Chakrabarty also discusses an altogether different mode of decolonization, which is less hierarchical and which he terms as dialogical. So without placing India at the apex, this second mode which we see to the right of the slide, opens cross-cultural dialogue, it acknowledges cultural diversity, and sparks global imaginations of identity. So through this prism of a dialogical mode, or one that is more collaborative, I will build the second viewpoint, i.e., the Malayan perspective or the context of reception. Now, if as all of us agree, artworks are open to multiple readings and interpretations, then surely the ideas of the recipients of this donation need as much attention as those of the donors. How did the curators at the University Museum receive and utilize these Indian objects, especially at a time when they were determined to break out of a British colonial framework to reimagine art history and museums? The short answer to this is that the 1959 donation was mobilized towards a revisionist curriculum and collection. I will pause here to unpack this twin context of decolonization and revisionism by turning to the scholarship of my predecessors in the anniversary lecture series. Professors T.K. Sabapathy and Kwa Chongwan. As many of us in Singapore, Malaysia, and this part of the world are aware, Professors Sabapathy and Kwa were students of the art history program at the University of Malaya in the 1950s and 60s. So who better than them to shed light on the philosophy and practice of their teachers, Michael Sullivan and William Willits, who, as mentioned earlier, also doubled as curators at the University Museum. The first curator, or the founding curator and lecturer, Michael Sullivan, included Indian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian classical, folk, and modern arts for collecting and teaching purposes. Sullivan's successor, William Willits, dedicated his exhibitions and teaching to the minor arts such as textiles and ceramics. Now you might ask, why must we regard Sullivan and Willits' collections and curriculum as revisionist? Well, because it is widely known that art history and an art museum, as defined from a British colonial perspective, was focused solely on Europe and its high arts. It made no room for Asian modern art, nor did it include the folk or minor arts such as ceramics or textiles. So by including these non-conventional categories, which we see on the slide, both Sullivan and Willits revised existing parameters of an art museum, art history, and its teaching. Additionally, since textbooks on Asian art were few and far between, the teaching of Indian or Southeast Asian topics relied on routine explorations of the museum's objects, including the 1959 donation. This means that this first of its kind donation of Indian objects served well to tighten the links between teaching and collection building, as first envisaged in the Carr-Saunders report, to be followed by Shastri's recommendations. So if you remember, friends, both these reports, the Carr-Saunders report and Shastri's report, emphasized the role of the University Museum and its objects in enhancing art history's pedagogies. I'd like to add here that even today, the NUS Museum remains a crucial resource, not just for the teaching of the art history minor, but also for an array of disciplines offered at NUS and beyond. Continuing to build on the context of reception, we ought to remember that the 1959 donation was received in a rousing atmosphere of nation building. This brings us to the third viewpoint, that of individual actors, leaders, writers, and curators who brought their ideas to bear on the imagination of a Malayan nation. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the term Malayan was heavily debated alongside decolonization, self-governance, and the proclamation of independence. Visions of what Malayan meant, whether as a nation, culture, or identity, and strategies on how it might be realized, played out across a range of sites and projects. A short highlights tour, I believe, can explain this assortment of imaginations. Our first example on this tour is a 6-part radio play titled A Nation in the Making, which was broadcast on Radio Malaya in 1957. It was written by a member of the then editorial staff at the Straits Times, Sinnathambi Rajaratnam. This play recognizes the transmission of techniques and materials between cultures to explain the imprint of many civilizations in a multi-layered Malayan history. Rajaratnam, as we know, would go on to lead Singapore's Ministry of Culture, also established in 1959. The ministry adopted language as a practical and cultural apparatus to address issues of ethnicity, social cohesion, and nation building. A visual reflection of this strategy is seen in Chua Miati's iconic painting, National Language Class, also painted in 1959. This painting, which hangs at the National Gallery, Singapore, depicts a group of Chinese students learning Malay as the newly designated national language. Next on our highlights tour is the first comprehensive publication of Malayan art written by the cultural commentator and art critic Marco Su in 1963. This publication, A Brief History of Malayan Art, poses crucial questions about Malayan identities by drawing on a long and varied lineage of indigenous and external cultures, primarily Chinese and Indian. It does not come as a surprise then that later in the book, Su regards Sullivan's collection building for the University Museum as discerning. As noted in the earlier section, Sullivan's collection building policy at the University of Malaya Art Museum was highly inclusive geographically, materially, and temporally. It shifted the definition of Malaya paradigmatically from an ethno-nationalistic or a Bumiputra identity to one that acknowledged the contributions of earlier Chinese, Indian, and Southeast Asian civilizations. So to recap this highlights tour of the imagination of a Malayan nation, whether Rajaratnam's radio play, Su's publication, or Sullivan's museum collection, each of these projects carefully considers Malaya's long history of relationship with other cultures, not so much as a result of colonization, as was proposed in the Indianization of Southeast Asia theory, as much as due to the seasonal pattern of winds and repeated movement of ships, which enabled objects, ideas, and people to circulate between places on their own terms. Therefore, Malayan, whether imagined as a nation, history, or identity, is not bound to a fixed territory, race, language, or culture. Instead, it emerges as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and polycentric entity. This plural conception of Malayan also manifests in the museum's objects, including the 1959 donation. In other words, when the donation is contextualized under the curated narrative of the museum, or even read as part of Sullivan's vision, it ceases to represent India as a place or a race-based entity. Instead, the donation suggests a wider, syncretic cultural system wherein intermixing and exchange are inherent facets of identity formation. This notion of intermixing informs the fourth perspective, which undertakes an object-based reading. So I'd like to pause here and recap the four viewpoints or the three viewpoints that we've examined so far. We have assessed the donor's perspective or the Indian viewpoint. Second, the recipient's point of view, which involves curators' aspirations to decolonize and reimagine art history and museums. And third, imaginations of a Malayan nation. Next, we move on to grasp what these donated objects might mean individually and or collectively. So as we continue to adopt a transcultural approach, each object personifies movement and intermixing of artistic styles and cultural ideals. As noted by Sullivan in the catalogue or the 1959 catalogue, the prehistoric materials represent the Indus Valley civilization's connections as far as Mesopotamia. Likewise, examples of Buddhist art display integration. Examples of Buddhist art display integration of Greco-Roman, Mediterranean, and Indian artistic conventions. Next, the sole Mughal painting in this donation, titled Hunting Deer at Night, combines scientific perspective, most famously celebrated during the Italian Renaissance, along with indigenous traditions of storytelling. So note how spatial distance and depth are simulated as the red sandstone bridge recedes in the distance. All the same, the artist chooses to reject rules of scientific accuracy. So despite the optical impossibility of spotting the birds in the darkness of the night, the artist makes them visible to us in the interest of storytelling and its attention to detail. So I do hope you all can spot the birds on the trees. We should have circled those in our slides. Okay, building on the theme of intermixing, next, we have the iconic M.F. Husain and H.A. Gade from the Bombay-based Progressive Artists Group. These artists approached European modernism, chiefly Cubism, through distinct individual and cultural sensibilities. The Baroda-based art historian, Professor Ratan Parimo, who knew Gade personally, analyzes this painting for us. The boatman, as we see, occupies the foreground. Now, following scientific conventions of spatial distance and depth, by right, the houses should occupy the middle or the back of the painting. But as we see, all these structures come together and they fuse in the front, along with the boatman, in a highly simplified cubistic style. Also note the exaggerated contrapposto or the tribhanga, the thrice bent figure drawn from Sanskrit literature. Similarly, Husain's birdcage presents a striking cubist conception of human figures in the company of a snake, a sun, a tree, and a cage, forms which draw on Indian cultural life for their literary and sacred meanings. Quite clearly, Gade and Husain negotiated European cubism with Indic frames of reference. And our last example in this theme of intermixing is Ajit Kumar Roy's Village India. This work, as we see, combines modernist vocabulary with artisanal skills. Strong linear renditions of human figures, paddy fields, thatched huts, and palm trees occupy a solid black landscape. The corn husks are painted on the black paper in order of their inherent tonal values to achieve shading or chiaroscuro. Individually, these artworks demonstrate a constant exchange, mixing, and mediation between Harappan and Mesopotamian, Italian and Mughal, and Parisian and Bombay-based studios and workshops. As a result, the 1959 donation and its artifacts bear testimony to a dialogical, a non-hierarchical, and a collaborative relationship between cultures across the world. It becomes important to ask, what do these objects have to say collectively? As noted by my colleagues Ahmad Mashadi and Shabir Hussain Mustafa on a previous occasion, perhaps all these objects were conceived as disparate fragments across India's long past. Who knows? They were not meant to be fused in a linear and a mythical story of a grand Indian civilization. By recalling the contributions of Greco-Roman, Renaissance, and Islamic worlds to India, this donation actually undercuts any place-based telling of cultural history. In other words, it reminds us that Indian culture is not limited to a fixed territory, nation, nor civilization. Instead, the donation serves as a metaphor for the dynamic, fluid, and ever-evolving nature of Indian art. Next, there might be some value in examining the selection of objects for this donation. A close look at the objects' dynastic and regional affiliations, their materials, and time period tells us that the selection does not correspond to the Indianization of Southeast Asia as was originally laid out in the 1959 catalogue. Now, what does this mean? So, as explored earlier, sorry, I'm just trying to get to the next slide. Yeah. As explored earlier, from the perspective of the Indianization of Southeast Asia, it is believed that Southeast Asian art and architecture, especially the Hindu-Buddhist traditions, are influenced by classical Indian idioms, namely the Gupta, Chola, and Pallava styles. So, friends, if this donation intended to promote the theory of Indianization of Southeast Asia, by right, it should have included more Gupta, Chola, and Pallava pieces. However, the donation consists of more medieval sculptures as opposed to classical pieces. In fact, we get only 2 sculptures to represent the classical Gupta period and none at all from the classical Chola or Pallava periods. As explained by art historian Gauri Krishnan, there is a strong chance that these selections and omissions were made with a view to dilute as opposed to promote the Indianization of Southeast Asia theory. The donation, as we've seen, responds much less to the idea of an Indian hegemon than claimed in the catalogue. This means that there is a disjuncture between official claims expressed in the catalogue and curatorial decisions made on the ground. It appears like individual curators, even on the India side, sought a corrective vision of South-Southeast Asian connections so that no one culture was viewed as superior or as a bringer of civilization, while the other remained derivative, inferior, or passive. Also, by choosing not to focus its attention solely on classical pieces, the donation included other categories such as the medieval, the modern, and the folk. It becomes amply clear that the curators in India were as committed to the idea of an inclusive collection as their Singaporean counterparts, Sullivan and Willett. Additionally, the donation's very broad India-wide coverage from Kashmir to the southern peninsula and from Gujarat to Bengal also deflects attention from any particular language-based groups. So instead of playing into the demands for a Tamil versus a Hindi-centered Indian studies program, this donation signifies a rare pan-Indianism which the New Delhi-based ministry emphasized repeatedly through Professor Shastri.